Hi everyone, nice to see you again. Like I said in the last video on pitch accent at least, today we will be looking at the case for the defense, in defense of pitch accent. A few months ago I was talking to a Japanese friend of mine, a Japanese friend who happens to be a Japanese teacher. We were talking about pitch accent and she made what I thought was a very interesting observation. She said to me that if a Japanese person was, for example, sitting in a cafe somewhere, sitting in a relatively noisy environment and overhearing to some extent a conversation amongst some group of other people, they would be able to figure out which words were being used in that conversation to some extent simply by the melodies or by the pitch accent patterns of those words. The example she gave me was the following pair of words: Oba-san and Oba-san. Now if you look at these two words, you'll see that one has a long vowel in the middle that takes up 2 mora, and the other has a short vowel in the middle that just takes up 1 mora. Strictly speaking, that's enough to tell them apart, but as my friend pointed out to me, you can tell them apart anyway by their melodies, by their pitch accent patterns. So even if you're just listening to a conversation with half an ear, so to speak, the melody gives away the word that's being said. The melody by itself communicates that word, even if you can't pick up on the difference in the vowel duration. Think about this for a moment. In English we have the following words: fission and vision. Fission has 2 voiceless fricatives in it, and vision has 2 voiced fricatives in it. If the difference in the fricatives is that some are voiceless and some are voiced, then if I whisper those 2 words, you shouldn't be able to tell the difference between them, because when we whisper, we're not voicing anything. So let's try a little experiment. Can you tell which word I'm saying? Fission. Fission. Yeah, it's pretty easy to tell which word I'm saying. But why is that the case? Why is it that we can tell the difference between a voiceless fricative and a voiced fricative, even when I devoice both of them completely and whisper them? At the moment I'm spending a lot of time studying Mandarin Chinese, and it's well known that Mandarin Chinese has tones. By changing the pitch contour in a word, you can change one word into another completely different word. But here's a question: can Chinese people understand each other when they whisper to each other? If it's all about pitch, Chinese people shouldn't be able to identify words very easily at all when people whisper to them in Chinese. What that means in plain English is that if you take the pitch out of these crucial pitch contours in Chinese, Chinese people can still identify the tones in question. How can they do that? The fact of the matter is that it's not obvious which pieces of information exactly are being extracted from the sound streams we listen to allow us to identify the words that those sound streams actually consist of. Our brains are not necessarily using the information that we think they're using. Sometimes they're using information that we have no conscious awareness or knowledge of at all, unless we study phonetics, but that's a separate matter, right? The other thing you have to bear in mind is that when we listen to spoken language, under normal circumstances we're listening to fairly rapid spoken language. People speak quite quickly on the whole, and what that means is that our brains have to do a hell of a lot of processing in a relatively short period of time to keep up with what's being said. That means that they're going to use any information that turns out to be useful. Now again, if anyone's familiar with the relevant research, and I'm not an expert on this field, so I wouldn't even know exactly where to start looking or how to start looking. But I have a very, very strong suspicion that the linguistically Japanese brain is actually surprisingly dependent on the melody, on the pitch accent patterns of spoken Japanese to figure out reliably in real time what's being said. In principle, it may be possible to distinguish between Oba-san and Oba-san purely on the basis of the vowel duration of that central vowel there. But in practice, as my friend pointed out to me, Japanese brains, let's say, are using the melody as well. These different words are sung differently in Japanese, and that gives Japanese people information as to what's being said, even when that information isn't strictly necessary. Basically, you have 2 streams of information here running side by side. You have this string of sounds, discrete sounds. In phonetics we'd call that the segmental side of things because it pertains to the individual segments and how they're pronounced. And then side by side with that you have supra-segmental considerations like melody, intonation, rhythm, and that is an additional layer that goes side by side, or, well, if you look at the word suprasegmental, it's laid down on top of the segmental layer, right? And the brain is processing both of those streams side by side in real time. What that means is that we're mining both of those streams for information as to what's being said. If you garble the melody, then what that means is that you're garbling one of those two streams of information that Japanese people use to figure out what's being said to them. The only possible consequence of that is that it takes more time for them to figure out what you're saying, and they do it less reliably, less accurately. Again, I'm sure that this stuff must have been researched by Japanese linguists, but I'm just not familiar with the relevant literature. Let's take a real example of this. Let's say you're by the sea in Japan talking to a Japanese person and you want to say, "Wow, isn't the sea beautiful?" What you would say would be this: "Umi ga kirei da ne." Notice that the two content words here, umi, sea, and kirei, beautiful, are both atamadaka. They both start off high and drop immediately after that first mora. What happens if I pronounce that sentence like this? Umi ga kirei da ne. Umi ga kirei da ne. Basically, I changed the pitch accent patterns of both of the two function words there. I would bet good money that it's harder and slower for Japanese people to understand Japanese spoken like that than it is for them to speak Japanese spoken normally, i.e. with a standard Kanto region pitch accent pattern. The problem here isn't that umi is one word and umi is some other word. The problem is just that it's not being pronounced the way they expect it to be pronounced, and that must make it harder for their brains to process what's being said. Now you might think, well, what if the Japanese speaker in question isn't a speaker of standard Hyojungo? What if they don't speak the standard form of Japanese? What if they speak some other form of Japanese with other pitch accent patterns? The inevitable consequence of that will be that they will be a little bit harder to understand for Japanese people who are not used to their pitch accent patterns. However, they will still be speaking some recognizable variety, some recognizable dialect of Japanese, and it's highly likely that the Japanese person they're speaking to will have some familiarity with it and will be able to pick up on what's going on quite quickly. You can draw a parallel here with English. Over the last few months, I've spent a certain amount of time listening to Kiwis, New Zealanders if you like, speaking English on YouTube. Whenever I start listening to a Kiwi, it takes me a few seconds. I have to say to myself, oh, they're from New Zealand, that's why they're making these weird noises. I'm talking about their vowels here in particular. They have some quite unusual vowel qualities. It takes me a few seconds to adjust, and then I think, okay, they're from New Zealand. Once that process has taken place, I can basically understand them as well as I can understand any other English speaker. Occasionally, I'll do a double take. You know, they'll say chicken instead of check-in or something like that, and just for a second I'll go, eh? But on the whole, it's not difficult to understand them. My students, i.e. people who study English with me, have much more serious, much more profound problems with English vowels. There are all sorts of vowel contrasts in English that they just can't produce properly at all. And that creates a whole other level of difficulty for me in trying to understand them. Now, messing up your pitch accent in Japanese is not going to create the types of problems that messing up your vowels will for people who are attempting to understand your English. I'm pretty confident that English vowel qualities are much more important in English than pitch accent is in Japanese. But you should remember that when you're speaking a foreign language, it doesn't matter which foreign language it is, whenever you do what the natives expect you to do, you're easier to understand. And whenever you do what the natives don't expect you to do, you're harder to understand. That principle always applies without any exceptions at all. And that principle doesn't only apply to comprehension, it also applies to comfort. If you do what they expect and make the sounds they expect, they'll feel more comfortable listening to you. If you make weird sounds that they don't expect, they'll feel less comfortable listening to you. If they feel comfortable listening to you, they will be more willing to talk to you. It can be quite draining when you have to concentrate hard on what somebody says to understand them. If you do Japanese people the favor of pronouncing their language well, you're doing yourself a favor because they'll be more willing to engage with you, and there'll be less friction in that interaction. Everybody who's ever studied any foreign language at all will have had moments where they say something to a native speaker of the language in question, and they can see from the look in the eyes of that person that they have not been understood. You have to bear in mind the possibility that your pronunciation is just not as good in Japanese as you think it is, and if it's not, one of the problems might be your pitch accent. This is especially true if the person you're talking to isn't used to speaking to non-natives. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today. Thanks for dropping by and watching the video. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much. Ciao ciao. Bye bye.